Hello everyone, I'm going to be going over how to draw in Tahoma2D. We've used it previously with images that we've imported and then animated from there, but this time we're just going to see how all the drawing tools work. So first of all, just a quick reminder, make sure that you are not using the sandbox as the current project because that keeps your files inside the app itself, which makes it harder to share, harder to back up, and it makes it more likely that you're going to lose your work if I update our version of Tahoma. So never use the sandbox for anything that you actually want to save. So if you don't have an existing project, which I do, you can click on the new project dialog, choose where you want it located, choose what you want the name to be. I'm just going to cancel because I'm going to use this existing project. Right, just a reminder, projects can have multiple scenes or they might just have a single scene depending on how you like to keep things organized. So you might have multiple scenes in a movie or in a single episode, or maybe each scene is an episode, or maybe each scene is just a related practice technique. However you want to organize is fine, as long as you have at least one project that you're working with. So I'm just going to give this some sort of name. The defaults are fine, and create scene. All right, now starting out, I have 3 different types of drawing levels, and just a reminder, a level is an animation asset that we're working with. So there are 3 types of drawing levels that we can add into Tahoma. This first one right here with the little mountain icon, if I click on that, brings up the new level dialog. Now this is just a practice, so the names don't really matter, but I highly recommend naming your levels descriptively so that it's easier to reuse them in the future, or easier if you're ever working as part of a team. So it's just a good practice to be into. From 1 to 1 means that it's just going to be creating a single frame. I could always have this go from 1 to 50 if I know I want 50 drawings, or I can add the other 49 later if I do want 50. So totally a matter of personal preference. I can specify the type, so raster right here, and I'm just going to leave everything else as a default. If I click on apply, it'll keep this dialog open. If I click on OK, it just creates the level. All right, raster levels are blue, and they all share a common palette in the project. So just a plus whenever I want to add a new color. You'll notice that some of my colors have these little brush icons. So with whatever color is active, I can use the brush tool. B is the shortcut. And if I use the default brush, you'll notice that some of the settings are a little bit different compared to when I'm using the other brush styles. So I can change the size. I can change how soft the edge is. The smoothness adds a little bit of a delay. So it'll be faster, but you can see also less smooth. I can play around with the opacity. I can lock the alpha so that anything that I paint on, it's only going to change where there are existing pixels. You always want to really keep track if lock alpha is on or if it's off. We can use any of the brushes that are on the raster tab here. I often like to start with the bulk brush with a particularly large size. You'll notice with the other brushes, instead of just the no brush, the default brush, there are a few different options here. We have size, so that's pretty big. I'll often use the bulk brush on a few different colors to just get started with whatever this is going to look like. You'll notice when you change color, the brush doesn't stay the same. The brush is linked to the specific style. So if you want to use it on multiple styles, you just change it. And then at this stage, I might come in, start doing some blending. You will notice that the size has a really big impact as you're doing any blending. Some of the blending brushes are much more painterly, some of them are more subtle. I'll often start with the blending knife, and then if I want it to be just more of a gradual gradient, and less obvious, I'll go over with the blurring brush. There are just a ridiculous number of brushes here that you can work with. If you have any brushes at any point that are your favorites, you can just right click, add it to favorites. It adds it up here to the top, so brushes that you use more frequently, you can just make sure that you have quick access to. And if you ever want to return to the default brush, you just click on the no brush icon. So this is going to act sort of as a background layer, and if you remember from when we were working with Tahoma previously, our images are going to display until another image shows up or until we tell them to stop. So maybe I want this to last for 50 frames. In that case, I might come over to frame 51 and then add the stop frame hold. So I can add it with the icon right here with a little X going through it. Or when I right click in one of the cells, I can also add a stop frame hold from the context menu there. Either way. So now after frame 50, nothing displays, but anything from frame 1 to 50, I have my background image. Now if I want to add additional levels, I like to keep them all on individual layers. I find it just an easier workflow, though you don't necessarily have to. But if I want a new level on a new layer, I can just click on my first cell here and then click on the new level button for whichever level type I want. So I'm just going to make another raster level. I'm going to say OK. Again, this is just a practice, so I don't really care about names, but that might be something I care about in the future. So just a few more things about drawing. First of all, when you hold down on Shift when you draw, it's going to lock your line to just be straight. If you hold down on Command when you draw, it's going to keep your line straight, but it's going to lock to 15-degree increments. So that can allow you to be very precise as you're drawing. If I have a closed shape, I can use the fill tool, though I don't necessarily have to be limited to a closed shape. Like if I just fill in the background, it's going to fill the whole thing up until the line. Now notice that there is a little bit of a gap between the fill and where the actual lines are showing. That is due to the fill depth over here. So I'm just going to undo with Command Z, and I can play around with the fill depth. I'm going to fill on the inside this time and see what, and just keep undoing until it ends up looking right. So it might be that I need to have these higher. It might be that I need to have them lower. It looks like higher in this case really helped. So you can see that that filled all the way up to the edge instead of having that little bit of a gap there. So F is the shortcut for the fill tool. You'll notice there are a few different options over here, but I'm just going to go back to the brush for now. All right, and again, B is the shortcut for the brush. Now let's say a few frames out, maybe I'm going to be doing some sort of ball animation. So maybe I'm going to draw another frame. Something that's helpful is if you do hold down on F for fill, but don't let go, so a long hold on F, I can use the tool, and then when I let go, it switches back to the brush. So you can temporarily switch between tools just by holding down on the shortcut, doing the action, and then releasing. All right, now I can just keep going on to another frame, do another drawing, but it's helpful to see what the previous drawings are doing. So I'm going to enable onion skin. So this little red and green marker is the onion skin control. And so if I drag out from that along this sort of bottom dark edge, I can add what's called relative onion skin, and I can have as many of these as I want, staggered however I want them to be. But it's going to allow me to see what's ahead and what's behind. And so now when I start drawing something, I'm still going to be able to see the previous. I can do that long hold on F, fill, and let go. And so I can just keep repeating this process as much as I want to. Long hold on F, fill, and let go. So I can just keep repeating that process. I can see what's ahead. I can see what's behind. I do want to mention you can also enable fixed onion skin, and so that's along the top edge, and so that's going to be visible no matter what frame you're on when you have fixed onion skin. If you want to temporarily disable onion skin, just double click on the control and double click again to make it visible. Now, onion skin by default just works on the current level. So if you have multiple levels or multiple layers and you want the onion skin to be working on them, when you right click in the viewer in the context menu, you'll notice there are some additional options here for how it's going to behave. So if you want it to apply across all of your levels, you're going to want to extend the onion skin to the scene itself. All right, but that should be enough about onion skin. And I do want to mention that that works for all of the different level types. Now, again, we can make all sorts of colors, we can use all sorts of raster brushes, but we can't use the texture or the vector tabs. They're not going to work on the raster levels, they're for the other level types. Now, I can change whatever brush is active over in settings. You'll notice there are a ridiculous number of settings that you can experiment with to really control how you want the brush to behave if that's something that you're interested in. All right, but I feel like that's enough about the basics of the raster levels. I'm going to make a new level starting on frame 1 so that it adds onto its own layer. And I'm going to use the one with the little palette icon here, and this adds a smart raster level. We have the same settings, it's just automatically the smart raster. I'm going to say OK to create it, and here we go. You'll notice that the raster levels are blue, the smart raster are green, so the type is color coded so it's easy to identify just by looking at the color. Now, you'll notice that the colors are different here. So smart raster levels and actually vector levels, which are the other level type, each one has its own palette and they're in no way related to the other levels of the same type or of other types for that matter. Now, I can add as many colors as I want, and if I add another smart raster level later, it won't necessarily have all these colors unless I come into the little menu and I can save these colors as the default palette. I've already done this previously, so I'm just going to overwrite it, add a couple more colors. So when I make another smart raster level, it'll have all of these colors. Otherwise, it'll just have the transparent and the black as a starting point. All right, now the smart raster levels are really interesting. So when you draw something, it is keeping track of what is a fill versus what is a stroke or an outline. And they call those lines and areas. Now, there are lots of things we can do depending on that. So there is this special tool right here, which is the Smart Raster tool. You'll notice I can have just the lines, the areas, or lines and areas for the mode. I think I'm going to just change this to another color over here. And so now when I paint with the brush, it's ignoring the brush style, but it's just overriding the color. And notice it is only painting where that stroke is or where that line is. So I can completely change that at any time if I need to. I can do the same thing for the area. If I want the area to be a different color, and I do have lock alpha on so that it's not going to be adding color outside, I can just add color where I want to. So you can see how this would be super easy, or not necessarily easy, but super helpful if someone is doing some cell shading. And another nice feature, because these are what are called color mapped, I can change the color on the fly and the entire level updates. And so that allows you to do really helpful things. And I can also target both the lines and areas at the same time, depending on what is helpful. All right, so that is the Smart Raster Brush Tool. I can use the normal brush tool just like normal, but there are some additional brushes that we can use and then some that we can't use. So as far as the raster tab goes, anything that is not for erasing or blending or smudging is likely to work. If it's a blending or erasing or blurring, smudging sort of brush, it's probably not going to do anything. But as far as the rest of them goes, I can use these brushes and they will work just fine. And they'll just do their thing. Now, when it comes to the fill tool, notice we have a lot of options. I can fill just by clicking with the normal. I can do a rectangular select. Actually, let me just create a few closed shapes to fill. Here we go. So normal I've already done, just click and it fills. Rectangular lets you drag over the area that you're going to fill. Freehand, you draw around the area that you want to fill. Polyline, you just sort of click around the area that you want to fill. When you come back to the start, if you double click or if you press enter, it'll create the fill for you. So several different types depending on the behavior that's going to be most helpful for you. We also can target just the lines, just the areas, or the lines and areas. This is definitely something where rectangular might be a little bit easier. All right, and there we go. So we can really do a lot of customizing at any time, which is super helpful. Now, something else that we can do, which is interesting, is we can actually fill across multiple frames as long as the drawings are closed and in a similar location. So if I turn on, let's see, go back to the fill tool. If I turn on frame range, you'll notice we have several interpolation types. Linear is just very constant and steady, sort of changing at the same rate or filling at the same rate in this case. Easing in starts out slow and then speeds up. Ease out does the reverse, and ease in and out starts and ends slow, a little bit faster in the middle. I usually keep this to linear for this sort of thing, but when, and actually I'm going to put the mode to areas. And I usually have a little bit of an overlap, so I'm going to deliberately drag over a larger area that I'm really going to fill, and I'll head over to my last frame that I'm going to fill on, and I'm going to again have this sort of overlapping area, and now it's filled in across all of those frames. So obviously this is going to be better for more simple shapes, but it definitely can save a lot of time. You do really want to keep track of if this is on or if this is off. All right, next up, I'm going to be adding a vector level. So again, I'm just clicking on my first frame here, and vector is this third one. It has this little arc, and all the settings are the same except the type is set to vector, so I'm just going to say OK. So vector levels are this sort of magenta color. Again, they have their own palettes, and that's each vector level has its own palette. So again, I often start just by getting a bunch of colors down that I might be working with. One thing that I haven't mentioned yet that is pretty cool, when I have a bunch of colors, I can select the range by holding on Shift, and when I right click, there's a palette gizmo, and I can blend to create a gradient from one color to the last color. So that can let you do something that's pretty cool. All right, now vector levels are the most finicky, but they have the most automation, the most customization. I'm actually going to just switch back to the black over here. All right, so the nice thing about vector levels is you can come in with the control point editor, and we can actually move the nodes and the handles around. Now, if I hold down on the Option key, it allows me to move handles independently if they're linked together. So Option, then I can move that separately. So I can completely change my line at any point, which is really helpful. If I realize, I don't want that control point, I can just select it so it's blue, and then delete it, and then continue adjusting from there. So I can make significant changes to this at any time. All right, you'll notice that the brush itself has a lot of additional options. So we have the size, we have the level of accuracy. Actually, let me just switch back to black so that it's a little bit more clear what's going on. You'll notice that when you have a lower accuracy, it's going to auto smooth more. And then the smoothing value adds that delay. I usually like to keep that down low. Now I can add auto close so that even if I'm not creating a closed shape, it's automatically going to close for me. I can turn on auto fill so that I can create the fill as I'm drawing. So you can just see how that would be a huge time saver depending on the style that you're working on. Now, when you're turning off autofill, you're probably just going to want to turn off auto close because it'll turn off everything. Then autofill will turn them all back on. There are a few things that need to be in place for autofill to work. Now, I'm going to just create a few empty frames to work with. So if I hold down on Shift and select Arrange, and then go just right click into the context menu, I can just create a bunch of blank drawings here. So there's nothing actually on these right now. They're all empty. And so on the first one, I'm going to turn range on. So again, we have those different types of interpolation or the different types of transition. I'm going to start with linear just so it's steady, but you can experiment. And I can draw something on my first frame. Notice there's this little X at the start and the line turns red. I can go over to the last frame, draw whatever I want my end position to be, and that is going to automatically transition from one drawing to the next. I'm just going to use the arrow keys to really quickly scrub through so you can see that transition. So that's a feature that can be super helpful and save a lot of time. But the interpolation type does have a huge difference, and you definitely really want to keep track of if this is on or if it's off. All right, now if you have closed shapes that you want to fill, there are a couple of things you can do. You can come over to the fill tool, and just like the smart raster levels, the vector levels are keeping track of, is this a fill or is this a stroke? So is this a line or is this an area? We still have the different types of ways to select. We have the different modes that we can select. We can also select fill across a frame range, and we have a value to check if there's a gap. When you use auto close, you don't really have to worry about this. If you didn't and there's a tiny gap, it may stop things from filling automatically, so sometimes you just need to increase this value. So I'm just going to switch to a different color and click and drag, and then it fills in. So that's something that's helpful. I'm going to turn off the visibility of the background for a moment, and I'm going to switch over to one of my other levels, maybe the raster level. Now, really cool thing about the fill tool is that if you're on either raster format, if you turn on refer visible, you can fill using the boundaries of the other levels. And that's for anything that's visible, which is why I turned the background off, just so that it wouldn't really get in the way. And so it's using that vector line as the outline, and then I can just fill. Sometimes I might need to change the fill depth as part of that, but that looks absolutely perfect at the moment. All right, now back to the vector brush. This is something that, just like the smart raster level, can be updated at any time. I cannot use anything on the raster tab, but I can use everything on the texture and the vector tab. So as far as texture goes, there are all of these pre-built textures, and so you can set that to whatever you want it to be, and it should update where you use it. If I'm on the vector level, or the smart raster level actually, I can use these textures. So you can see how that got filled in. There are some settings, they don't actually work on the vector levels, they will work on the smart raster levels. So I can have these different patterns. On the vector tab, first we have these generated styles. Any of the ones with the diagonal swoosh are for the style of the line. Sometimes they have additional colors that you can choose as part of it. Any of the styles that sort of fill the entire square, so all of these lower ones are for fill styles. So if I switch one of these, it's one of the fill styles, like this one creates a gradient. So I have two different colors. that I can change between for however I want that gradient to look. Now for the vector styles, I can change the settings depending on how I want things to look for the gradient. So I have a lot of customization that I can do as far as that goes. So next up we have custom styles, and these are just all little images that repeat across the line, and they're only for the line styles. If I come over to settings, some of them have different options, but generally speaking, you can adjust the distance, you can adjust the rotation to change how that's looking. And then lastly, we have just these different brushes, and again, they're for strokes, but they just stretch out the image across the stroke as a whole, which can give you some interesting results. And that'll update across the whole level wherever you use the style, which is something that's a huge time saver. Now, whenever you're using any of these styles, you can just click on the No Style button and it returns you back to the default if it's not something that you want to keep. Back to the Smart Raster Levels for a moment. They can't use anything on the Vector tab, but they can use things that are on the Texture tab. So let's say I'm going to use this brick texture, and I'm going to fill that in there. Now it's just sort of using the average color. It doesn't look like anything's happening. So if I turn on preview, and by the way, I highly recommend saving before you turn on preview. You should just Command S to save. Now you can see how that texture is looking. When I come over to settings, I can adjust the scale and it's going to update. I can adjust the rotation. I can change a ridiculous number of things depending on how I want it to look. And you'll see different options available, I think, depending on which one you have selected. I do like to turn preview off whenever I am done testing that out. All right, so I think that's it as far as just the qualities of the different levels themselves go, at least to start out with. I do want to mention we have an eraser tool, though when you are on either the Smart Raster or the Raster level, and if you're using the Brush Tool, most of these can be enabled as an eraser on the, I guess just maybe just on the Raster levels. So let's say eraser, and now it's going to erase in that style. So that's something that can be interesting. All right, last two things that I wanted to mention, and these work for all of the level types, is we have a Symmetry Tool. When we enable the tool, we can decide how many lines, so how much symmetry we're going to want to enable. We can change the color of the symmetry widget so that we can see it a little bit more clearly. We can grab on the center to move the location that's centered around. We can adjust the angle with the little yellow handle. So when I come back into my level, oh, I still have the eraser on. I always keep track if that is on or not. So now anything that I draw is going to be perfectly symmetrical. And that works for all of the different level types. If I want to disable symmetry, there's this little icon over here. Now it's back to normal. Now symmetry is back on. So if you want parts to be symmetrical and parts not to be, you can just keep toggling this on and off depending on what you need at the current time. I'm just going to switch to another frame that has a little less going on. Next up, we have the perspective tool. So this little sort of grid icon right here. Now we have different types of perspective that we can enable, and I've worked with this previously in this project, so this is just showing what I had active last. I'm just going to remove these so that you can see what you'd start with. So generally speaking, you choose if you want a vanishing point or a line, and if I click, it's going to add whichever type I've selected. So I can move the location, I can adjust the rotation, and I can adjust sort of the spacing. I can also adjust all of those things across the top. I can change the color. I can decide if I want the horizon to be active or not. All sorts of things I can do. Similarly, I can add lines, and so wherever I click, it's going to add a line. I can make the line parallel. I can adjust the spacing. I can adjust the angle. Maybe I want horizon off in this case. So whatever is going to be helpful. Maybe this one is going to be a different color. Maybe with a higher opacity. Now when I come back to draw on any of the level types, if I hold down on the Option key when I'm drawing, it's going to lock the line going towards the vanishing point or going in the direction of the grid. I don't necessarily have to be anywhere near the line or the vanishing point for this to work. And it's just the Option key. Now, if I don't want to be drawing towards perspective, I can just toggle, or I don't want to be able to see the perspective, I can just toggle this off at any point to go back to normal. I do want to mention you can have as many vanishing points as you want. You can have them out of the camera view itself so that they're off more to the side, so that the perspective is a little more accurate. There's a lot we can do when we're working with perspective. But I feel like that's probably it for the most part as far as basic drawing goes. Certainly you can experiment with some of the other tools. For vector levels, anything in this range is specifically for the vector levels, so have fun experimenting with how those work. All of the levels can use the geometric tool, which has several different shapes that you can work with. So like with the arc, you click at the start, at the end, and then the top. Polyline works just like the pen tool, so just clicking gives you straight segments, clicking and dragging gives you a curve, clicking and dragging gives you a curve. If you hold the Option key, you can adjust the angle of the curve. You can also hold on Option to go back into the center to get back to a straight segment. If you get back to the start, it creates a closed shape. Vector levels have an autofill option when you're using the geometric tool. The other levels do not, so that's just something to be aware of. All right, but I think that is pretty much it.